The truth of the matter is that family caregivers can be financially, emotionally, physically, and mentally damaged by the situation of 24/7, 365 caregiving. And that's the thing we really need to stop. No one can do it alone.
It takes a special kind of person to be a caregiver. But what does that even mean? What is a caregiver? Well, it's a person who tends to the needs or concerns of a person with short or even long-term limitations. It could be due to illness, it could be due to injury or even disability. But when it's your own, when it's someone in your family, a spouse, elderly parent, child, relative, someone with special needs, the unpaid caregiver, the responsibility is greater and the emotional toll is also greater. And these are conversations that I find myself having more as I'm in the second half of my life, seeing friends going through it, wondering what's next when the roles change, the sandwich generation, as we call it. And so this is a topic I haven't covered that I really feel we're hearing more about. And I wanted to bring somebody in who understands it, who has been through it, and is holding space for people on both sides. So, Deborah Greenhut, you join us on Holistically Speaking. You are an international speaker, author, and caregiver advocate, and you have your own story to tell. So, thank you for being here and sharing your wisdom in this very sensitive topic.
My pleasure, Hilary. It's really a delight to be here with you because I think we need to put a lot more light on this subject so that people don't suddenly find themselves in the middle of it, because everyone is going to encounter it sooner or later.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We tend to sweep things under the rug. We don't want to deal with them yet. I'll just think about it later. It's almost like when you want to talk about the wills, when you want to talk about what your wishes are, or just how you want care. These are very sensitive topics that sometimes it's like, I just don't want to think about it. But when you think about the numbers, and we were just talking about this, that 100 million US adults function as caregivers, providing care for a child, a parent, or a relative. And 53, as you said, close to 60 million now, US adults are caring for a spouse or elderly parent or someone with special needs, a relative, those unpaid caregivers. That's a lot of people not talking about a topic we need to talk about.
Yeah, it seems to hold true globally too. It's not just here that we are facing this dilemma, because in multi-generational families are slipping away as a model all around the world now, where people's children are not staying home to take care of them. So everyone is going to have to come to terms with it.
Can you share a little bit about your story, why this is such an advocacy for you?
I had a couple of caregiving experiences, so I'll just mention those briefly. About 25 years ago or so, my parents, who were both pretty ill, but they were a doctor and a nurse, were not doing well, and they weren't that old compared with how long people are living now. My mom was only 71, though, and my dad was 80. And my mother died suddenly, unexpectedly. We didn't expect this would happen first. Suddenly, I was my dad's caregiver because my mom had done everything for him. He was a doctor, but at home, mom was the boss. And even in his office, she was the boss. And overnight, I inherited all of her responsibilities. And a not very well dad who was suffering from cardiac problems and some mental health problems. And that was my first introduction at 45 years old to caregiving. And that's about when it hits for most people. So I have a lot in common with most generations. My second caregiving experience was a little bit more bizarre, let's say. My husband, we discovered when he was 55 years old, had been living with ADHD and possibly 10 other different mental health disorders, which all of a sudden seemed to be challenging his ability to function. And so I became a kind of caregiver, except in those days, it was understood that the family should stay away from the patient. So the way people were treated, the family was set aside and told not to interfere and only to give praise and not be part of the picture. But I also had two high school students, to my two high school children, to continue to raise while their dad was learning how to be a person all over again, which included getting speeding tickets and other sorts of strange behavior that he had never exhibited before, while we had to teach our children to drive. So that's just a top layer of the iceberg there. So that marriage was 35 years long, and by the end of it, his anger and his frustrations were so great because the help didn't help, let's just say. And it was complicated by hoarding, which I probably should have mentioned up front, which had escalated to a point where I couldn't live in the house anymore. So our marriage ended at that point. My third caregiving experience was for someone I met and fell in love with much later in life, recently. And unfortunately, a diagnosis of Alzheimer's intruded on our very special relationship. And so it wasn't possible for me to take care of everything by myself. I'm going on 73 now, and I've learned there are some things I cannot and should not do. So that's the overview of caregiving. And I've learned quite a bit along the way about we need to have some huge reserves of rational thinking in order to survive this caregiving journey and not be burned out at the end of it.
And I imagine it's very easy to reach burnout when you feel like you're trying to take care of yourself and it's no longer just taking care of a child, and maybe you're taking care of both. Maybe, as we talk about the sandwich generation being, we're seeing more of that, where you're taking care of the ones that are your children, and then you suddenly become the parent to your parent. Where does that leave any energy and time left for self?
Right. A lot of us complain about being time crunched all the time, and we often are. And we carry that habit right into caregiving of not taking personal time. And sometimes the caregiver is the one who's not doing it. Other times, the care situation has made it impossible to take personal time out or to take a vacation or anything along those lines. I do get a little frustrated with advice columns that say, oh, you should take a bubble bath and relax, because the kind of exhaustion you feel, whether you're a mom or a senior taking care of someone else, is not going to be relieved by a bubble bath. So we've really got to come a lot further in terms of figuring out how to give respite care to caregivers.
Do you feel like there's enough services that exist out there for those who are the unpaid caregivers, or is that kind of part of your purpose?
That's part of my purpose. I think
Yeah.
awareness is a very big part of it. I've seen and have experienced many times family members in my own and other families who say, well, you're doing it, so I'm not going to help here. I'm not going to be part of this. And people come up with lots of reasons for why they're not going to help. But the truth of the matter is that family caregivers can be financially, emotionally, physically, and mentally damaged by the situation of 24/7, 365 caregiving. And that's the thing we really need to stop. No one can do it alone.
Yeah, not everyone has long-term care either. I mean, I learned this recently, within the last 5 years when I lost my stepfather. My mom was taking on the role of the caregiver, and I remember telling her, and you can't tell people, especially when it's somebody that they care about and love deeply, they feel nobody can take care of that person as well as they can. And it was like it took a lot of time to bring in awareness that, you know what, you're meant to be the emotional side of the support. And it doesn't mean you can't care for the person, but it's how much can you show up for somebody if you're not showing up for yourself? And I think maybe that's where you're going with the whole rational caregiver.
The impulse to do caregiving is usually born of love for someone, or at least
Yeah.
respect or a sense of duty. And that often gets everything else really twisty, because you will set aside your own needs because you love someone any day of the week. That will happen. Made that kind of commitment to someone. And yet, the rational side of you may be saying, you really need a good 10 hours of sleep tonight to make up for the last 2 weeks. And the rational side gets just pushed aside by the love when you're worried because no one else will stay up all night to make sure this person doesn't wander.
Are there certain things that we can do if we find ourselves in that situation as a caregiver for a family member? to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. As you said, it's more than just a bubble bath.
As with any job, I've been a manager and I've done a lot of other kinds of work. If you are overwhelmed, you need to figure out how to delegate. And very often when people call me and say, what should I do? My first thought is, well, have you called the county where you live to see if there are any services available? Because you might be surprised. There might be a bus, there might be a daycare situation, there might be all kinds of things that you haven't explored. You can also put together a contract with your family. If this is a family member and there are other people, you can say, well, here's what I'm willing to do. How are we going to cover these other areas? If you're saying, yes, I'll be the main caregiver, you still need to get an agreement from the others about how all these things will be covered if you can't hold up or you can't do everything every day. It's been estimated that probably a caregiver has to deal with 20 systems, 17 to 20 systems every day. You have to figure all those things out for the other person before you take care of your own needs. So it's really important to think upfront about who are you going to delegate to and who is your backup, because you will need time off if you're going to survive. And the reason I say that is that among elder caregivers especially, your chance of dying before the person you're caring for is 60% or more greater than the rest of the population. Because you will probably encounter a disease such as diabetes, hypertension, or heart disease because of the stress of caregiving. I'm not saying it causes diabetes, but it certainly would accelerate it. So I have, in fact, that was part of my own story. After my father died, I learned that I had diabetes. And I don't think caring for him for a couple of months caused it, or taking care of all the rest of their business for 2 years caused it. But the stress of all that with no help certainly accelerated all of it.
Yeah, I didn't even really think about that. I mean, it is that age where we start seeing changes in our own bodies without any help of any stress, but we add stress on top of that, and it definitely can accelerate any maladies or illnesses that could pretty much stay dormant or maybe not even make a show unless the stress levels go up, because as we know, stress can be a killer in its own right. I'm curious, I want to go back to something. By the way, you mentioned the non-negotiables, that you have a Substack. I do want to mention to those who are tuning in that Deborah has graciously offered to share the 52 non-negotiables for caregivers. I'm going to put a link in the notes of this podcast so that you can grab that. Also, you have a survival guide for family caregivers, and both of these will be available. These are things we don't think about. We think about, the will and the home and what we need to, how are we going to make the house accessible? But really, there's so much more that we don't think about until we're in it. And then when we're in it, it could be very overwhelming. So this is helping people process things and let them know there are services, there are ways to manage this. And yes, ask for help. Ask for help. That's a big one, I imagine. Yeah. The other thing is that, Deborah, that you mentioned about giving people duties in the family, delegating, rather, as you said. Where have you seen in your experience the issue that comes into play of maybe there are a couple children that are involved with a parent that needs additional help? One is taking on way more than the other. Does that cause a lot of rifts in the family? And we're seeing a lot of upset between siblings because of that.
Absolutely. I think there was a film about it some years ago about the complete implosion of a family because of a caregiving situation. And one of the things I found, though, is that if one person is no longer available to do the caregiving, all of a sudden the money and the resources will appear to do it. These people will figure out how to fill the gap without doing the work. So that's something to be conscious of. I mean, that's the same kind of thing that happens at work. You're indispensable until you say, I can't do this anymore. And they hire 3 people to replace you. So that we know that that's probably what will happen. Now, the downside of that, of course, is the people who didn't want to do it may not be as attentive to the person you are caring for, and you need to be able to let that go. If you're going to stop or wind back, you can't be what I call carezilla about what happens if I don't do it, because it turns out no one can be that perfect. Surprise of all surprises, 24 hours a day, every single day of the year. It's just not going to happen.
And that also goes back to the idea of finding people who this is what they do. Like this is their job. If you can afford it, or even if it's like maybe just giving you a break once a week. And I remember having this conversation even with my own mom. I'm like, just give yourself a break. You need the break. And what started out as a half a day, one day turned into the long-term care or hospice even, or having somebody that can come in just to support you and be on the job doing what they're designed to do so that you have a break and then you can be that loving partner or parent or child to that person that needs the additional care. But of course, that's not always a possibility if the financial situation isn't there. How do you really face that battle when it really is a question of finances?
I think that's where communities can be especially helpful. And sometimes people are too embarrassed to turn to any religious organizations they belong to and say, I need help, because they've been the helpers all along. So they don't want to change that role. But, as at work too, there are ways to delegate. It isn't always, I'm going to give you this task so I don't have to do it anymore. That doesn't work in a regular work situation. Sometimes people need to learn how to do the task that you want them to do. So you have to take time to train them. So it really, I think caregiving is better conceived of as a management position than as a servant position. So that's the first adjustment I would try to make as a caregiver. I'm not your servant. I don't work for the rest of you. I'm going to manage the situation for you. And if you can't help, we will have to find finances to do it another way, or services or resources. So please go out there and research for me.
And there's also information overload. I just had a different conversation on a totally different topic dealing with the medical world. And it's like, you can really get pulled in and pulled down the rabbit hole of trying to find what resource works, what answer, what diagnosis, whatever it might be. And, we live in this WebMD world that everything's available to us at the touch of a finger, but what's really helping us and what's hurting us? So how do you know you're making the right choice and before becoming really indecisive and just throwing your hands up in the air?
Yeah, that's where the planning part of management comes in. And you really have to step back and say, unless these conditions are met, this is not the right service for me. Or you can make the other choice and say, I need to accomplish X, and it may not be perfect or perfectly done, but I need to make some headway on this particular problem. So we have to learn to be patient with less excellent results than we might have wanted for our parents or for our child in order to get through the day sometimes. It really doesn't pay off for the person who's doing the caregiving to try to be a superwoman or superman, because men do it too. It's more about 60% women, but 40% of men. 40% of caregivers are also men.
Yeah, and what's the difference in the dynamics? How they deal with the situation from what you've witnessed or studied?
Women have been, at least in my generation, have been cultivated to be more emotionally engaged in the situation. And men are a lot more practical. They will solve those practical problems. So if you want to figure it out and your emotions, your love feelings are all tangled up, I would say find a man to talk to about it, because they will give you the task-oriented solution to the problem that you have, or at least point you in the right direction. The difference might be in terms of how much emotions are taking over the process. We all have them, men have them too, but some people have been better trained to set them over here while they're trying to do a task. And work, I think, has channeled a lot of that for at least men in my generation as well.
Yeah, it's the polarity. I mean, the balance too. But if you're losing part of your polarity because you're taking care of the other part, that could be difficult. It's maybe trying to find someone or a group of people who can help you in that area. So there's some semblance of balance.
If it's your parents, consult a geriatric social worker, because this person has the training to give you a comprehensive overview of what you're going to face. They understand the conditions the health conditions, they understand the finances, they know where to look for good long-term care, and they will evaluate for you. And depending on how much you can pay, you can have them actually provide services to take away some of those systems that you might have to deal with. They can take over bill paying for your parent, for example. And all of this, of course, requires some trust, but it's on a fee basis and they are bonded. So there is some protection of your own assets. But that's one suggestion I would make in The Rational Caregiver. So in that book, what I did was to try to provide a framework for approaching the situation. So the first level of the frame would be to assess what's really going on in the situation. When I walked into my dad's house, for example, I had no idea about my parents' finances. My mother had been fibbing to me for a long time to cover the upset that she was feeling about not really having enough money to do this very much longer. I didn't know anything about where their wills were. My mom had said, oh, I'm going to put it in such and such a drawer, but she never did. We never found it. So not having essential information, it makes it difficult to accept a job. So it's like taking a job without a contract, to use that analogy again. But when you go in, you need to figure these things out first. You know, what's going on here is a really good question to ask if the person is able to speak to you. Otherwise, you're going to spend possibly months trying to figure it out, because you can't say, yes, I'll accept this until you know what you're accepting. And that's the fatal error a lot of us make because we love somebody. Of course, I'll help you, Dad. Of course, I'll help you, Mom. And we don't even know what we're helping with. So as best as you can, long before these things come up, have some family conversations if they're willing to. Otherwise, you're going in with the blindfold on and earmuffs, because you just don't know and you haven't heard what it is that's really bothering them. Eventually, you can accept the deal, but you need to go through some stages of finding out what's going on and deciding, not accepting, but deciding whether this is for you or whether some other arrangement needs to be made. And then investigating some of the resources. And I know emergencies happen. Mine certainly was one at that point, but I've learned by the third time that I had to go in with the blinders off. When my partner developed Alzheimer's, I had to say, there are some things I cannot do here. And had I not done that, I would have been, once again, quite overwhelmed, and maybe the diabetes and hypertension would have been the killer this time.
That's the rational caregiver.
That's the rational caregiver.
That's the side that says, I have to take a step back and take care of me.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned something about the overwhelm and you know, when you're burned out and you're emotional and you're in it and it's the first time everything's being thrown at you, that's a really difficult place to be taking on. Well, we need to do this and we need to do that. And you're like, I don't even know where the will is. I don't even know where the medication is. I don't even know what they're on. So having these uncomfortable conversations can help you in the long run, and not only help you, but think about the person that you are rationally caring for, right?
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
it's really important, really good information. And just to reiterate, the book is The Rational Caregiver, top seller on Amazon, from what I see in the physician and patient communication category, which is also very important, right? So, and you do have another book that you're releasing that is more of a novel that you've released, which is called The Hoarder's Wife. And you briefly mentioned that as well. Is this novel based on your own story or is it
Yes.
fictional?
Yeah. It's a novel, but it is based on experiences that I had, and I think that in a mental health illness situation, things are, based on my experience, a lot more complicated because you don't want to take away the autonomy of the person who is suffering. And yet, I do find that many families report a lot of trauma from trying to support someone who is going through this type of crisis. And since it was a long-running crisis for us for about 35 years, I think we were all pretty worn out by the end of it.
And we've seen the TV shows and the documentaries that are out there, the series,
Yeah.
and you feel for these people because it is an illness and it is a problem and it's not just a problem for those who are living in it, because sometimes they don't really see it. It's those who are around them trying to support them as well. So are these two books that you wish you had when you were going through it? Would they have helped you?
I think so, although I know from my own experience, it's awfully hard to listen to someone who's saying, for your own well being, step back.
Right.
I don't know if anyone made a compelling argument about that to me, but in some situations, I couldn't figure out how to step back. I don't think there were as many resources, but now there are people who can help you. And I think it's largely because so many more baby boomers have been going through it. And as you know, we're a large group of people. So we are
Right.
going to make a demand for more resources.
Great. Baby boomers and now the Gen Xers, really. I do want to mention those that are tuning in, these two freebies that Deborah is graciously offering, one being the survival guide for family caregivers. I'm going to put that link in the podcast notes, her Substack, which is 52 non-negotiables for caregivers. My friends, if you're going through this, or if this is just an inkling in the back of your head, like, what could this be my story? Why not just download these resources so they're there? They're constantly being changed. You're constantly upgrading and updating, right? And then, of course, your books, which is The Rational Caregiver. And then also you have your novel, The Hoarder's Wife. If any of these topics touch you in any way, either for yourself or someone you know, just give this podcast a listen, pay it forward, and then give yourself a chance to really take advantage of these resources that are offered, because there are, and I do want to remind folks, there are resources. Sometimes we just don't know where to look. And Deborah, you're making it much easier for folks who might just find a little glimmer of hope in this conversation. So thank you. I do a game at the end because I say this all the time, that in the healing, there's always a little bit of humor. We have our little stories that happen and we look back and we're like, oh, I had to laugh about that. We have to find those moments. So would you take a moment just to play a little rapid fire with
I'll
me?
try.
Okay, so this game is something I do with all of my guests. Basically, I throw out a word of something we mentioned here on the show, and you just need to come back with the first word that comes to mind. Like, what resonates with you when I say such word? Okay? All right, let's give it a go. Crisis.
Management.
The other brain. That's 3 words I know, but it's something you said.
Rational behavior.
That's good. I threw you a loop on that one. Delegate.
Give it up.
Manage.
Calm.
Geriatric.
I can't come up with one word, but it's a place we all fear, but we'd approach it better if we learned how to be better caregivers for ourselves.
Oh, yeah. It starts within, right? We have to take care of ourselves first. That's good. I'll give you that one. Rational.
Caregiving.
Hoarding.
A tragic situation.
Caregiver.
Every adult should be one.
Carezilla.
My favorite monster, my favorite name for myself when I'm going over the edge.
It's good that you can find that humor. You gotta have a moment of light within, because it's hard. Life is not easy.
Oh.
It is not. And I know we can all tell stories and we all have a story, but I really appreciate you being here to share yours on many levels, numerous stories that you've been through. And I guess sometimes our pain becomes our purpose, and hopefully we can, be someone else's survival guide. Is there anything you would like to share last minute with closing words for Holistically Speaking listeners and those who are watching?
I'd like to thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to reach more people. I can only do so much as one person, but these interviews are so helpful because we know we can touch that one person who's really looking for an answer. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure and an honor. Be sure to take advantage of what Deborah is offering. And if you know somebody that could benefit from being a rational caregiver, consider paying this episode forward. Share this episode. You'll also find some valuable resources in the notes of this podcast episode that Deborah has generously shared, including her survival guide for family caregivers and 52 non-negotiables for caregivers, and of course the book. And one thing Deborah expressed is the importance of taking care of yourself. Self-care is so valuable for your emotional well-being. I can help you with that, to give you tools to be kind to your mind to use every day when you need it most. These are valuable neuroscience-based techniques that you can use anytime you need to hug it out with yourself and be kind to your mind. You'll find those links to connect also in the podcast notes of this episode as well. And one thing you can do to help get this podcast out there is to let just one person know that this episode exists. This conversation is out there. Pay it forward, download it, share a thoughtful response wherever you are tuning in. Let others know that this episode exists and it could make a difference to just one person. Holistically Speaking is edited by Two Market Media with music by Lipmo Redding and of course supported by you. So thank you for making me part of your day. And a final reminder, you always have support. You are never alone. And sometimes all you need to do is just ask. You'd be surprised who might show up and say, I've got your back. Always remember that I love you, I believe in you, and I'm sending hugs your way. Be well.
I know the girl